Hey, Sahar Galt here, and I'm going to show you how to mix. No one knows how your song should sound better than you. And learning the tools and techniques of mixing are crucial to capturing your vision. In the process, you have massive influence over prominence, atmosphere, and color of all the parts you recorded, making mixing as much a creative endeavor as it is a practiced skill and craft. Let's get to it. Here we are in the project that we began in the tracking video, and the first thing I need to do is jump into the mixer. You can do that by pressing F3. And if I play a bit of the song, you can see the main stereo out into which all the tracks feed, sometimes called the master bus or the stereo bus, is getting too loud. We don't want this meter to go over 0. See, no individual track is clipping, but the sum of all the tracks is overloading the master bus. And if I were to export this as it is, I'd get a distorted mess. So I'm going to bring all the tracks down by 10. If I select them all, press Q-Link, I can move them all simultaneously. Then remove Q-Link and the faders will act independently again. In bringing down the faders on every track, I don't just avoid clipping the master bus, but I also give myself a lot more room to balance levels between the tracks. Now let's start with some rough balancing of levels. Right now the guitars, bass, and backing vocals are probably too loud compared to the rest of the tracks. I'll bring those down even farther. You can do that here in the inspector for each track, as well as on the mixer. The result is the same. Your choice. In addition to volume, you can also balance instruments spatially, and that's called panning. You can hear the effect as I pan this part through the stereo field. Now, at this stage in my mix, most everything is panned dead center, because that's the default pan location when recording. But with everything in the middle, the mix will sound cluttered and narrow. As a subtle change, I'll move the backing vocal off the main vocal, putting it slightly off center. And that guitar part we double tracked, I'll pan one track all the way left and the other all the way right. It gives a really immersive effect. I have some toms that I'll pan somewhat closer in than that. And I'll leave the lead vocal, bass, kick drum, and snare all in the center. The overheads, room mics, and piano tracks are all stereo, meaning they contain their own inherent stereo image, so I'll leave those alone. Now that everything is opened up a bit, I have a much wider soundstage. Equalization, or EQ, is the process of boosting or cutting specific frequencies of a signal. Our hearing extends between the frequencies of 20 Hz and 20 kHz. And cutting or boosting within this range not only has an impact on the character of the sound, but also influences how parts will interact. Equalizers started out as hardware devices that looked like this Pultec, which is the first program EQ ever built for audio, allowing the mix engineer to select a frequency band, boost or attenuate that area, and the bandwidth giving control over how wide a swath is affected. And some of these first EQs ever developed are also still heavily revered for their sound, and many are still in use in studios today. Nowadays, though, lots of mix engineers are working in the digital domain, mixing, as we say, in the box. And we have equalizers built directly into the DAW software. With a parametric EQ like this one, built into Cubase, I can boost a frequency band, adjust how wide of a boost it is, and even move that chosen curve around. But those beautiful equalization curves designed into the hardware devices, and that ineffable character of analog, is something that was long missed when it came to mixing in the box. But now, thanks to companies like Softube, those highly sought-after analog devices have been recreated and modeled in the digital realm so we can all get our hands on them. For example, this is a Trident A-range equalizer, and only 13 were ever even made of the original console that this comes from. And I happen to really love how it brightens up a sound. Here I have it loaded up as an insert on my piano track. Listen to the effect as I dial in 8 kHz and boost the frequencies. This section here is a high shelf, meaning all the frequencies above 8 kHz will be boosted. And the original? And the EQ? The effect of this brings out the brilliance of the piano, and it almost sounds like we've cleared away some haze that was making the piano sound indistinct. I should mention, cutting high frequencies has the effect of pushing something farther back in the soundstage. Now let's talk about a more sophisticated example of EQ. If I have two signals panned in the same place that also occupy similar frequency space, one part will tend to mask or block out the other. And no matter what you do in terms of volume control, you'll always end up with one part that's just kind of inaudible. But you can equalize the instruments selectively to get them to occupy different frequency spaces, so that both will be audible together. To drive this point home, instead of two separate instruments, I actually have two mics recording the same instrument. My kick drum. One mic at the beater, and one mic at the front of the drum head. I'll start with the beater mic. I want it for its percussive smack that'll cut through. For this, I'll use Softube's model of the Summit Audio EQ-F100. It's a great full-range EQ that I really like, and it has the flexibility and feature set we need for this complicated task. Over here, we have a high-pass filter, which lets all frequencies through except those below the selected frequency. On most tracks, it's a good idea to click the high pass to at least this lowest setting. We can't really hear below 27 Hz anyway, so it's a good idea to cut that out if you don't need it. I'm actually going to dial it up to its highest setting, because I don't want the beater mic to be bassy at all. It's going to do a different job. Now this is a low pass, which lets everything through except what's above the selected frequency. Here again, we can't hear much above 18 kHz, so it's not a bad practice to cut that out of signals where we know we don't need it. Okay, moving on, I'm going to be more aggressive cutting out the lows on this mic. Over here, I'll dial in a cut rather than a boost. Bring the gain up, which in this mode means it's cutting out a lot, and make sure it's set to a shelf rather than a bell. A bell does a bump or a notch around the selected frequency, but I want to clear away as much as I can from this setting down. Now, if you listen, I've taken all the bass out of this thing, and now I need to accentuate the beater sound I'm after. I know that sound lives higher up, so I'll select 3.9 kHz, leave the setting on boost, and bring the gain all the way up so I can hear what I'm changing. These are bell EQs, so bandwidth, which is sometimes called Q, determines how wide or narrow the bell is. Too narrow, and you can see that it's a little tunnely. But if I widen it out, you can see I'm getting somewhere. Now I actually want a little bit more than this, so let's jump down to 8.2 kHz. Make sure it's in bell, and boost it too. Now we're in business. Now I've just isolated that tap of the beater on the drum. Since I took all the bass out of the beater mic, the front of the kick drum mic is going to be the one that's responsible for the power and body of the kick. For this, I'll pull up the TubeTech PE1C, which is actually a clone of the Pultec EQP1A. I'm going to select the bass frequency I want to boost and turn this dial here to boost it. I'm also going to attenuate the same frequency. I know that seems like it makes absolutely no sense because I'm just subtracting out what I boosted. But in this style of equalizer, boosting and cutting at the same bass frequency actually creates a resonant shelf, which creates a shelf at and below the frequency you're boosting, and a dip directly after, which is perfect because once you've isolated the frequency around which you want your bass drum to live, the resonant shelf opens up room above it in the frequency spectrum for other instruments, like, for example, your bass guitar. Okay, since the beater mic is taking care of the high frequencies, I'm going to attenuate those out of this one. Playing the mics together again, you can hear the beater mic is far too loud. If I bring that microphone down and level, now I've got the start of a great kick drum sound. Here's what it sounded like before. Messy. As a listener, I can't tell where the focus is. And here's what it sounds like after. See, now my ear's drawn to what's important in the sound. And you can hear the two tracks working together. If I take the beater mic away, I lose all the definition. If I put it back, you can hear the beater mic just kissing the kick drum, and with each hit, there's a rich, deep thump for power. Now that's the principle of EQ in essence. We're trying to carve out space for instruments, highlight what's important, and cut away what we don't need. Now let me say, don't get too caught up in what's the right way or the wrong way to do anything. All that matters is that the mix sounds like what you imagined in your head. If you've achieved that, then you've succeeded. Compression is a tool that controls the dynamic range or volume of a signal. All performances have some kind of fluctuation in volume on a large scale. But instruments themselves also have their own small-scale fluctuations, owing to the fundamental nature of the instrument. A snare drum has a fast, sudden burst of volume, followed by a swift decay of the hit. By contrast, a piano has a more round attack and has much longer sustains that diminish more gradually. Whatever the case, the character of these volume fluctuations can be controlled by a compressor. The reason for doing so is often to chop off volume peaks in order to maximize the volume of a signal, prevent clipping, sculpt the punch or round out a sound, or simply to color the tone of an instrument with the sound of the compressor device itself. Most compressors operate with a few simple controls. There's threshold. Basically, the compressor reduces the level of the audio signal fed into it if the signal gets louder than the threshold. Thresholds are usually measured in dB, where a lower threshold means the quieter the sound that will activate the compressor. Ratio determines how much the signal which has exceeded the threshold is diminished. 4:1 ratio, for example, means that a signal needs to go 4 dB over the threshold to achieve a 1 dB rise in output level. Or you can think of it this way. If the input goes 4 dB over the threshold, the output signal will be 1 dB over the threshold, meaning a gain reduction of 3 dB. Attack is how fast the compressor reaches a gain reduction once the signal has exceeded the threshold. Release is how quickly the compressor lets go after the signal has fallen below the threshold. Occasionally, compressors contain a knee setting, soft or hard, which controls the rate at which the compressor transitions into a chosen compression ratio. A soft knee, for example, gradually increases the compression until it reaches the selected ratio, giving a smooth transition from uncompressed to compressed signal. A hard knee will do this more immediately. Finally, makeup gain is how much to increase the overall signal. Since compression reduces volume, albeit selectively, you may then want to compensate by bringing the overall volume up afterwards. So let me show you a way to get started setting up your controls on a compressor. I'm going to use the TubeTech CL1B on my drum room track. And the first thing I'm going to do is set the threshold all the way down, max out the compression, set the release fairly fast, and set the attack as fast as it'll go. You can hear everything sounds flattened out, and that's because the compressor's catching everything. So I'm going to slowly dial back the attack until I hear the snap come back in the snare. There it is. Hear that? I can even slow down the attack farther and get some of the rumble out of the toms. Now I'm going to adjust the release slightly to make it just a little bit more graceful. Let's put the compression ratio where we actually want it. I'm going to go for around 4:1. Now I'll back off the threshold until the view meter, which is showing us how much we're compressing the signal, goes back to 0 in between hits. As I do this, you can see that the drums start to sound a lot more lively. Now I'm going to adjust the makeup gain to increase the signal by about the amount we're knocking back by the compression. Now I'm bypassing the compression to compare volume with the original signal. I want to get the compressed signal to the same volume as the original so I can make an objective choice on whether the change helped. Just about even. There. Now that the volumes match, I can tell that the compressed part sounds bigger, with more energy. This is a rock song, that's what I need. Now I'd like to show you a couple variations on compressor design that you'll come across, just so you know how to operate them. The first is a delightfully simple concept. This Summit Audio TLA-100A eliminates the threshold control entirely. You simply control how much gain reduction to apply alongside a knob to control the output level. The LA2A leveling amplifier is another famous compressor that works like this. This compressor actually has a few controls for attack and release, and Softube has augmented the original design of the hardware device with a saturation dial so you can control how much harmonic distortion to add. There's a low cut, so bass signals won't trigger the compressor, and a parallel inject setting, so you can let some uncompressed signal in with the compressed signal. It's an elegant design that requires a lot less fiddling than other compressors. Softube's FET compressor has a control set like a souped-up 1176 peak limiter. Compressors of this type have a fixed threshold, and you simply control whether your signal triggers the compressor by driving the input control. Compressors of this type often have the speed settings for attack and release transposed compared to other compressors, meaning leftmost is slowest and rightmost is fastest. To complicate things even further, the original 1176 used a higher number to signify faster attack and release. Watch out for that. Luckily, Softube has simplified this problem using fast and slow. There are also some extra features like external sidechain, low or high cut on the detector circuit, and the parallel inject. Alright, those are the 3 most common compressor control sets you're likely to come across, and now you know how compressors work and how to use them. So far, the tools we've discussed afford us control over spatial positioning, frequency balance, and volume. But there's another powerful element we can control in mixing: depth, or a sense of space. And one of the main ways to influence that is with reverberation, which is basically the buildup, reflection, and diminishing of echoes after a sound. Reverb can be created physically through chambers, plates, or springs, or digitally with impulse responses that capture the characteristics of a reverberant space or device, or through algorithms that allow you to dial in and control specific parameters of reverberation. And in applying reverb, we can place a sound in a space of our choosing, real or invented, or control the depth back or forward of a sound in a mix, or simply to give the right atmosphere to a sound. Anyway, we're going to talk algorithmic reverb. Before we go on though, I should say, reverbs are usually applied to signals which are recorded in a room that itself has very little reverberance. If you've recorded a sound in a room that has natural reverberation, like what we did with the piano in the tracking video, you probably don't want to apply reverb on the top of that. Anyway, to use a reverb, you can load it as an insert, as we've been doing with our EQs and compressors. But I always think it's best to load it as an effect, which we can then use as a send from the instrument to which we'll apply the reverb. The distinction here is that the entirety of a signal is sent through an insert. A send, though, allows us to mix a chosen amount of the effect with our untouched signal, which affords us the most freedom. It also allows us to send multiple instruments to the same reverb. Okay, first, we're going to add an effect channel. We're going to load up SAR1, Softube's true stereo algorithmic reverb. It is in fact a stereo effect, so we'll want to choose stereo here. If you choose mono, rather than the reverberation being spread around the stereo field, you'll get it pinpointed in one location. There are actually scenarios where that's nice, but we're going to use this as a stereo effect. Now our reverb's loaded up, let's tap one of our effects and send it to the reverb. We'll send a lot right now, just so we can hear the effect of the reverb. We'll rein it in later. I'm going to loop a region so we can focus on playing with the settings of the reverb. This is going to burn the phrase into your brain, but that's the nature of mixing. Okay, first let's bypass the effect and just get a sense of what the dry signal sounds like. Machine code. Now let's switch on the default reverb setting. Straight away, we see we can control the size of the space. This is done by manipulating early reflections, which are the first reflections of sound off of the imaginary walls back to our ears. If the early reflections take longer, our brain tells us the space is bigger. Now, Softube's done a really cool thing here. We can isolate the early reflections, or we can isolate the reverb tail. Both are interesting effects. For a more likely usage, though, we can mix some proportion of both together. Diffusion controls the smearing of the original sound in the reverb. Low diffusion leaves you with more of the original signal distinct in the reverb. This also has an impact on our impression of the thickness of the reverb sound. Use low diffusion to keep the reverb from taking up too much space in the mix, high diffusion for a more lush effect. Modulation allows you to create either a fast or slow chorus-like effect on the reverb, which can be a neat touch, or just leave it on random for a more natural reverb sound. Pre-delay adds a delay before the reverb tail starts. It has no effect on the early reflections. You can add a little bit of pre-delay to help a part stay forward in the mix by letting some entirely dry signal peek through before the reverb tail begins, or you can set it way up to create some interesting rhythmic effects. Time is simply how long it takes the reverb tail to diminish. This also plays a role in how our brain determines the size of a space and how reflective its surfaces are. Again, you can dial it all the way up to create a really interesting effect. A long, endless wash of reverb. Density lets us control how thick the reverb tail is. And in drawing a parallel between actual spaces, low density acts like a large space. High density behaves like a small one. Like with diffusion, use a less dense tail to thin out your reverb in the mix. Tone controls the rate at which high frequencies decay. Bright settings let high frequencies diminish more slowly, vice versa on dark. High cut is an EQ attenuation of the high frequencies for both the reverb tail and early reflections. I'll slide it through so you can get an impression of what it does. It's control over all these parameters that make algorithmic reverbs so powerful. You can craft exactly the reverb you want that perfectly suits your mix. The resulting reverberation may well not sound like any place that exists in the world, which is a conceptual idea that I actually love. We can create what we imagine, and we don't have to be restricted to what actually exists. And when you've put all the finishing touches on your mix, it's time for a mix down. Title your track if you like, select WAV as the file type, we don't want to degrade the quality, and select the same sample rate and bit depth that you've been using in the project. Hit export, and soon you'll have a high-quality audio file that's ready for the next step. Okay, any questions about mixing? Ask me in the comments. Next time, we're talking about mastering, which is the final step in preparing your music for production. Thanks for watching. I'm Sahir Galt. I'll see you next time.